All right, well, let's get started. Hi. So this talk is called Software and the Game of Go. My name is David Nolen. I'm a software engineer at Vouch. At Vouch, we're building a platform for secure access to real-world assets, even if you're not online, which is pretty unique and pretty special. At Vouch, we do a lot of ClojureScript and Datomic, and as well as custom hardware and firmware. So it's pretty neat. It's kind of like, it's pretty challenging. It's fun. If you're interested, we have a booth. Come talk to us. Okay, so this is a Go board, a traditional Go board called a Gobon. And most modern Go games start like this, with an empty board, like an empty page, right? And you have a brush or an empty canvas. Thank you. And that's really quite different from probably the most popular game of this type in the West, right? In chess, you start with something. There's something already on the board. The pieces have a very specific place they have to go, and they're in opposition, and the sides of the boards matter, right? The ranks. Go doesn't matter, right? There's no specific designation to any side. You can place the stones wherever you want, and again, you start from nothing. In chess, you remove things, right? You remove the opponent's material to get an advantage to finally make the checkmate. That's the goal of chess. It's a sort of subtractive process. And in fact, there are many endgames where you have no idea how you got to that endgame, right? It's just whatever the endgame pieces were. You don't know how you arrived there. But in Go, since pieces do not move in Go, and it's only cumulative, the game actually has a record of everything that occurred at the end, right? The game at the end is covered with stones, and it's a very precise record of what's occurred. And I think this is why the ancient commentators of the game, and we're going to get to the history in a bit, said that Go is very much like life, right? Because life is a cumulative process. In fact, most things in the real world are cumulative. They're not subtractive, right? We learn things. We evolve. We're at companies. The product evolves, right? Things our information is being added to the system. And Go reflects that. And I think this is why, again, the ancient commentators say all of life is contained in the Go board. The universe, everything is there. And that's why I think it's kind of an interesting thing to design a talk around. I'm actually mostly going to be talking about Go, not that much about software, but you can make it of it as you will. I think there will be things for you to take away and apply to your software practice or management practice or product practice or whatever. Okay, so if I'd given this talk like 10 years ago, I think people, and more than a few people would have been like, I don't even know what that is. You're talking about Go, the programming language. I think in the past, I would have conversations like, yeah, Go, and then be like, think I'm talking about Go, the language, when I'm talking about the game. I think now it's a bit easier. DeepMind did a historic match between their reinforcement learning system, AlphaGo, and Sedol in Seoul. DeepMind, I think, did a pretty good job getting more people in the West to understand what this game was, but for various marketing reasons, all they say is that Sedol is legendary. They just say it's legendary. And if you're from the West, you just take their word for it. We don't have the context or the culture to understand who this person was. So the first bit of the talk is just going to be about a history lesson. Those of you who know me and see me give talks, I love history. I think it's very hard to do anything or to really understand things if you don't know the context. And so we're going to get into that. In order to get into that, we do have to go back about 2,500 years at least, right? 2,500 years at least. Some people believe that Go is 4,000 years old, but it is mentioned in the Analects of Confucius, making it at least 2,500 years old, right? Around that vicinity. In ancient China, people played the game. I mean, most of the things, we're going to go over the rules. So some of you may have never played it. You've seen it, but you don't know what it's about. We're going to go over the rules after the history bit, the context bit. But most of the rules we'll talk about were already known 2,000 years ago. The size of the board, 19 by 19. Those things were already established. One thing that's slightly different is that in the ancient Chinese records, most of them start with stones in the corners. And that will be altered by the Japanese. But it takes about 1,500 years. In the year 1347, the knowledge about Go was already very high, right? This is 1,000 years after the Analects of Confucius. A book was published in China called The Profound and the Mysterious, or The Gateway to All Marvels, and it contained many, many master-level Go problems that the game hasn't changed. So people still study this today. You have to be a strong amateur or near professional strength to understand the contents of these books. Somewhere in 500 AD, the game arrives and it starts getting played by the sort of Japanese aristocracy. Traditionally, Go, Weiqi in China was one of the sort of arts of the sort of the culture and the cultivated: music, calligraphy, poetry, and Go. So it was adopted by the court people. Murasaki Shikibu, who wrote the book, probably arguably one of the very first novels, definitely I've read it, which it took me a long time. It's amazing. It's incredible. It was written by a woman in the court, the Heian court. I don't know if I said that word exactly right, but probably written the year 900 or 1000. And she talks about three times, I think, about court ladies playing the game of Go. And it's clear that it's Go because they talk about counting, and counting is an important aspect of the game. Now we fast forward about 600 years, or 500 or 600 years. There was a series of warlords who were trying to unify Japan, culminating in Tokugawa Ieyasu. He establishes the Tokugawa shogunate, and he was a huge fan of Go. So Go it can be considered a kind of war game, and it's actually, there are many generals who are interested in it. He was a huge fan, and he established the 4 Go houses, the most important being the Honimba house. So he set up government support for the game. So if you were a top Go player and you belonged to one of these houses, you'd receive an extremely generous stipend. So this was a way to make a living if you were a prodigy. The shogunate lasted about 250 years. 2 Go saints appeared in that time. So these Go saints are people who, in Japan, they regarded as have really changed the game or changed the thinking of the game, or extraordinary geniuses. The first was Dosaku. He actually had no peer. There was nobody as strong as him when he lived. He was in the early 1600s. He really established all the modern thinking about the game. So somewhere in the 1500s, the Japanese had eliminated the opening stone. So the Chinese were playing with those opening stones, and the Japanese eliminated it, paving the way for coming up with an opening theory about the game, right? Until that happened, you really couldn't say there was opening theory. The Japanese call that fuseki. Then you also have Shusaku. Both of these people belong to the Honimba house, this house that I'm talking about, probably historically the most important house. Fast forward from about, Shusaku dies, I think it's 1860 or something. Fast forward another 70 years to the 1930s, and there's a famous match between the last Honimbo, the last living Honimbo. So the way that it worked in the houses is that you had the title of Honimbo, you were the head of your house, and then you would find somebody who was equal to your level, and you would pass it on, and they would carry on the skill that the house represented. So Honimbo Shusai was the last one. In some sense, this book, Yasunari Kawabata, was the first non-Westerner to win the Nobel Prize for Literature. Not for this book, but for all of his works. But this is a very interesting book called Meijin, which translates roughly to the Master of Go. It's about the retirement game, the last Honimbo's last game, because what he was doing was he was, in some sense, paving the way for modern Go. He effectively sold the Honimba title to the Nihon Kin. The Nihon Kin was the Go professional organization, and they needed to change the system, right? There was a growing amateur interest in the game. People were like, I have my favorite player. I want to read about them in the newspapers. I mean, the newspapers would fly off the shelves just so people could look at the game records of these matches. So the Nihon Kin was creating a culture of interest in Japan around these games, and this was sort of the transition. The old way died, and the new sort of modern 20th century Go begins, the sort of tournament-style play. Honimbu Shusai played a person. His name was Katani Minoru. He lost. He lost by 5 points to Katani Minoru. Katani Minoru was really good buddies with this guy, Go Seigen, who was not Japanese. He was also a prodigy who was discovered in China and then brought to Japan, arguably one of the greatest players of the 20th century. His reign lasted about 30 years. 30 years he was one of the strongest players of the game. Katani Minoru and Go Seigen created the new Fuseki. So Dosaku sort of laid down the foundations, and at the beginning of the 20th century, Katani Minoru and Go Seigen sort of made the new theories that people kept riffing off through most of the 20th century. Really interesting. And people often say Go Seigen was the most impossible to understand and impossible to emulate. I think his powers of evaluation are really great, and people often say Go was like AI before AI. But what about Korea, right? I'm talking about China, I'm talking about Japan, but where does Korea fit in this? Well, in the 30s, Korea was still like a Go backwater. People were playing a form of Go called Sunjang Baduk, in which many stones were placed on the board, right? So there are so many stones on this board. Even if you don't know anything about this game, all it's going to lead to is it's a bloodbath, right? It's going to be a complete bloodbath, right? Just battle, duke it out. And what's so funny about that is the Korean style is known as the fighting style. And people say that the fighting style probably came from this culture of this sort of Sunjang Baduk. But, you know, what happened was there was another sort of like prodigy. His name is Cho Namchul. He went to Japan. He met Katanu Minoru, the person that beat the last Meijin, right? He met him, and he was a boy. And Katanu Minoru was really impressed with Cho Namchul, and he said, wow, you're very talented. Cho Namchul comes back to Korea, and he has seen the Japanese system, and he wants that to happen in Korea. He wants to recreate that sort of culture of extremely high level of play. So he sets things into motion to adopt the Japanese style play, no beginning stones. He helps establish the Hanguk Kiwon, which is the Korean version of the Nihon Kin, the Japanese professional Go organization. The Hanguk Kiwon is the Korean version of that. And then many decades pass, and the level of play keeps increasing. It keeps increasing until this prodigy appears, Cho Hunyan. Cho Hunyan also goes to Japan and studies, meets another famous person, which I can't talk about everybody's names, but what's interesting about Cho Hunyan is the level of play had reached, was pretty high, but yet Korea had not made any marks. But Cho Hunyan got invited as the sole representative to the very first Go Olympics in 1988. It's called the In Cup. The In Cup. The In Cup only happens once every 4 years. Every top player from the major institutions get invited. The Japanese Go Association, Chinese Go Association, Korean Association, Korean Go Association. But Cho Hunyan was the only one representing the Korean Go Association. So you're not going to know these names, but people like Kobayashi Koichi, Fujisawa Suko, Keita Masao, Cho Chi-hoon is actually Korean, but he played for the Japanese Go Association. Takamiya Masaki, these are like giants, like unbeatable players. Unbeatable players. There's only one Korean, the Cho Hunyan. He's the second one on this list. He's an underdog. No chance, right? Korea. Nobody knows anything about this country. And he wins. He defeats everybody, and he beats Ne Wei-ping, who was an extremely powerful player. So nobody expected this in Korea. Cho Hunyan returns to Seoul to, like, you know, thundering throngs. He, like, the president's there, and, like, he is instantly a national hero. And it kicks off major governmental support for the game and the development of the game in Korea. It really becomes almost like a nationalistic game. So Cho Hunyan, the strongest player in the world, and he defended that title by continuing to perform well on the international stage and in the Korean title matches, which were by that point very, you know, those were strong tournaments. He only had one student, Lee Chang-ho. Lee Chang-ho was his only student. So Cho Hunyan's nickname was the God of War, right? And so, like, these Go players, they have the coolest names. So Cho Hunyan was the God of War. So he represented the flair and the style and the fighting spirit. And it's not that strange that his one disciple was kind of like the exact opposite and sort of atypical. Lee Chang-ho's nickname was the Stone Buddha. So it was, people described playing him as being very strange. He would let you do whatever you wanted, but you would still lose. Which is really amazing, and nobody could handle him. And this is a record of Go playing strength for the past 40 years. The first red line is Cho Hunyan. He's overtaken by his one student who takes away all of his titles, and Lee Chang-ho dominates the scene undefeated for 15 years. He still is on record as of holding the most world titles of any player. I mean, to be the top player for 15 years is unheard of. The other reason he was called the Stone Buddha is because he never showed any emotion. So, like, if you ever watch Go players playing, they're like ruffling their hair, or they're snorting, or they're like frustrated, or they're running off to grab tea, and you can never tell what Lee Chang-ho was thinking. Lee Chang-ho's reign only ended after the appearance of Sedol, right? That's when it ended. That's why DeepMind chose him, right? So this is like, now you kind of have the context. Why was Sedol the right person for AlphaGo to play? Because it was part of this really long story of all these people that are connected. The match was great. I actually watched the whole thing live. It was like, really tired because, soul time. It was amazing, especially to see the one win live. There was only one win. So AlphaGo won 4 games, but Sedol won 1. He played this. And people said, some people said, this is a divine move. And that's a phrase. When you say the divine move, it means something in Go. It means it's like a move handed to you by the gods, right? The move that nobody could see, like a holy move. Technically, this move doesn't work. And it's been refuted. It does not work. But AlphaGo, that version of AlphaGo, could not find the refutation. And so, Sedol wins 1 for humanity. So it's still the Korean Go is at the top, right? So the 2 top players, the top female player is Choi Jung, who's really cool. So if you get into Go, you can download these records. They're publicly available. She's a very interesting player. And then the top player in the entire world is Shin Jinsa. He's actually way above everybody in a way that has not occurred probably since Yi Cheng-ho. And he's really interesting. People say he's the closest to the AI style. And it sort of makes sense because he grew up sort of in the context of AI appearing. Okay, so now we have some context. Let's go quickly over the rules. I'm just curious. Raise your hand if you know the rules or if you've ever read about the rules. So not bad. It's about half, so it's okay. So we're going to go through them pretty quickly, and it'll be my take on the rules. They are very simple. I mean, that's why people love this game, is that it doesn't take that long to go over the rules. Oops, okay. Well, anyways, the first one was 2 players, black goes first, 1 move per player, you take turns. The stones are only placed at intersections. You don't play inside the square. You often see this in Hollywood movies, and it makes me really angry. Once a stone is placed, it does not move. You do not move the stones. What's the goal? So people often say, what is the point of the game? There is only one goal. It's to build borders and then to enclose more territory than your opponent. We're going to ignore diagram 1. Just focus on diagram 2. If we want to count the score, if we look at white's territory, what we have to do is we count the intersections, and that includes the edges of the board. So if we include the edge of the board, there's 4 vertical lines inside of white's wall, and there's 4 horizontal lines inside of white's wall. So 4 times 4 is 16. So white has 16 points. I think black has 45, so black is winning. But that's what you do. You count the intersections regardless of whether they're on the edge of the board or they're a corner or not, right? Even the corner counts. So let's talk about liberties. So you can play a stone anywhere you want on the board, anywhere, as long as it's on an intersection, right? As long as you don't put it in a square, you can do it. When you put a stone down, all the lines that touch your stone are the breathing room. They're called your liberties. And you can count them. Counting is an important part of Go. So 4 lines touch that stone, so there are 4 liberties. There are 4 sort of breathing spaces for that stone. Beginners often confuse the diagonal intersections, but they're not touching the stone. There are no lines there at the diagonals touching the stone, so those aren't liberties. Only the lines that touch the stone represent the liberties. So if your opponent happens to cover each liberty with one of their stones, in the first diagram you say that stone is an Atari. It could be captured as in diagram 2 if it's white's turn. White can capture it and remove that stone from the board. If it's black's turn, black can add a stone on where that last liberty is and create sort of a compound thing. It's a group. He's made a 1-stone group into a 2-stone group. Any stones of the same color form 1 string of stones as long as they're connected on the lines, on the straight lines. Diagonals don't matter, right? They have to be connected on straight lines. So what happened is that black gained 3 liberties by doing this. There are now 3 lines touching that group. So black had 1, now black has 3. You can only play 1 move at a time. So just by doing basic arithmetic, it's obvious that capturing stones is really hard and cannot possibly be the point of the game. It cannot possibly be the point of the game because it's too hard to capture stones. Okay, illegal moves and exceptions. So in diagram 2, you can play anywhere you want on the board, but you can't play in the middle because you can't play in a place where you have no liberties, right? You can play anywhere you want on that board except for in between those white stones because you have no liberties. There's only one exception, is if the act of playing it would capture your opponent's stones, therefore instantly giving you the liberties that you need. So on the bottom, white has only 1 liberty now. Black can play there because it'll capture it, and that black stone will then have liberties, right? It's the only time you can play in a place. It's often called the inability to play in a place without liberties is called the suicide rule. Ko is a tricky one. Ko is like actually, the usage of Ko is very sophisticated, and it's very hard to understand, and you have to play a lot to get it, but you don't need to know anything about that to understand why it exists. So in the first diagram, the triangled stone, black could capture it, and that's the state of diagram 2. And if there wasn't something special, white would capture it in diagram 3, but that's the same as diagram 1. Then you go to diagram 2, then you go to diagram 3, and now you're stuck in an infinite loop. The only reason the Ko rule exists is to prevent this, right? So diagram 4 shows what must happen. You cannot return to a previous state of the board without doing something. You just can't. It prevents it, right? So white wants to take it back. Well, white has to play somewhere else first. Black says, okay, I want to answer that. And then white can retake the stone. But now you see this forces unique states of the board. Unique states of the board. That's what the Ko rule is about. How to use it, not important. It just exists to prevent this loop. Okay, that's it. We're done learning about Go. Everybody else, the other half now knows how to play. There's nothing else to know. So, you know, mathematicians, I think mathematicians in particular are fascinated by this game. Historically, especially before the rise of computers and software, it was the math people that liked Go. Because math is sort of primitive. Go is sort of primitive, right? There are primitives, and everything else that you want to know about the game is derived, right? It just emerges from the things I just said. There's a thing called life and death. When people say life and death, they're talking about whether a very large group of stones can be captured. We didn't see that. Life and death is whether I can capture a very large group of stones. This is a derived rule. It's just based off everything we've already said. So here, we have a group of black stones surrounded by 4 groups of white stones. There are 4 groups of white stones, right? Groups do not form on the diagonals. There are 4 groups of white stones covering all the outside liberties of the black group. So if it's black's turn, black plays smack dab in the middle, creating 2 internal liberties. All you need to know is the suicide rule. If you know the suicide rule, you know that this black group is immortal. It just became immortal by playing that move. It's uncapturable. So in Go, people talk about making bases. Enough space that you could guarantee the construction of 2 internal liberties such that your opponent can't kill you because they can't play 2 moves in a row. You can't play 2 moves in a row, only 1 move at a time. In order to kill this group, because there are 2 internal liberties, you would have to be able to play 2 moves at the same time, which is illegal. So that's completely derived from the suicide rule. Okay, so there are many other things that we could derive, but that's I think enough for now. Scoring, when you get to the end. Sorry, it's like. Once both players pass, you can begin scoring. You remove all prisoners, you know, which are stones that can't live. Of course, this stuff takes some time to sort out. 1 point for each empty intersection in your territory, 1 point for each prisoner, and you just tally it up. So if I have 14 points of territory and 3 prisoners, 14 plus 3 is 17. That's my score. I compare it to my opponent. Whoever has more wins. The only weird thing is that in Go, because of the nature of the black playing first, right? Like many games, the initiative is a problem. Initiative, right? Who plays first matters. Therefore, white is granted some points at the beginning of the game to compensate for black's initial advantage. So if you start playing this game and you start getting into it, what you quickly discover is Go is fundamentally a game of trade-offs, and balance. This is a game record. We're not going to dive into it, but this is a game by Dosaku, which he considered his lifetime masterpiece. And he lost it by 1 point. And so, again, he had no peers, but he played against a very strong player, and he gave him 2 stone handicap, meaning 2 black stones were placed on the board before they start, which is about starting 20 points behind. You're giving up 20 points of territory to give away the stones. So Dosaku was able to architect a game, and this is why it was his masterpiece, 20 points behind, and he's actually going to lose by 1 point on purpose. Right? So this was his artwork, to play 20 points behind against a very strong player and lose only by 1 point. So let's talk a bit about the golden rules of Go. There's actually these 10 famous golden rules, and I think these can be applied to any type of work and definitely to software. What are the 10 golden rules? You get into the game. What is the game about? And the 10 golden rules reveal a lot of the mystery, I think. Greed never wins. So when you watch people starting out, you make something, and then somebody's like, oh, I'm going to destroy that. And they just immediately jump in, right? And you see this, especially with like young people, and they're starting to learn. They don't yet have the judgment to see what's fair. What's fair? I get this, you get that. That's okay. It's okay. Your stuff, my stuff. I only need to win by 1 more point than you. It's okay. You can have something. And this is what you got to realize. I don't need to win by a lot. I just need to win by 1 point. Half a point, really, in the modern system. Do not rush in blindly. You have to make plans, right? Something is happening, and you want something to happen. You want to do something, but you must arrange for that idea to happen successfully. Be prepared when fighting. So this is saying, okay, you have a challenge coming, but before you get into it, you need to assess your own weaknesses. What are your own flaws? Before you decide to engage in something, you have to correct your own flaws, or maybe decide, actually, I have too many weaknesses, and that's not really a fight worth having. Another one that's really hard for beginners is sacrifice to gain an advantage. So these little stones, when you watch, again, people who just start, they want to capture 1 stone. But we already said that capturing it's not the point of the game, because it's kind of impractical to capture stones. So it's okay to give up small stones. They're only worth 1 point. Maybe at the end they might be really valuable, but generally, especially in the beginning and the middle stages of the game, 1 stone doesn't really matter. Drop small, save big. It's like small things. You've invested 1 thing here, but then you have a big thing here, and maybe that's in danger. Prioritize what's actually urgent. Pick the urgent thing. Work on the urgent things, especially the things you've already invested in. But the corollary is do not waste on the unsalvageable, right? It may be the case that you did invest somewhere, but now it's unsavable. And it's so important to identify it's not worth saving. It's not worth saving. I can't do anything about it. It didn't go my way, and we focus on the other side of the board. And that's one of the big differences about Go, and that's one of the most exciting things, is that when you play, it doesn't take very long before you have games where you're like, oh man, they just killed this. And then 50 moves later, you still win the game, right? Because it's a big board. A lot of stuff can happen. There's a lot of chances to turn the game around, which I think is really key. It's really interesting. I think that's also distinct a bit from chess. I mean, if something really bad happens with the material, sure, you can win, but it gets really hard. In Go, I think it's more possible. Think before action, a really basic one. This is one of my favorite ones. Duet with strategy, right? So this is saying that the game of Go necessarily requires 2 people. It's like a song, right? It really requires 2 people to make any sense, and there is strategy involved. And so when I think of problems, software problems, the only way to make something beautiful is to have constraints. Like you need this opposition, whether that's requirements, whether that's users, it doesn't matter. Something only gets great is going to happen if there is this sort of thing pushing back against what you're trying to do, and you're strategically thinking about, okay, there is a resistance. Can I work with that resistance to make something better? Strong walls over weak stones. This is saying, coordinate your moves. Coordinate the things you're doing. Like, again, people that start out, they just sprinkle stones all over the board. But those are just independent stones who have no relation to each other. There's no relationship. You sprinkle things on the board, those things are disconnected. This is saying coordination. Only through coordination is you're going to get anything that makes sense. And then finally, look for balance and gain influence. And this is one of the most subtle ones. Looking for the balance of the game. What is the reasonable thing? What is the thing that makes sense? And then there's a hard word, this word that's used in Japanese and in Chinese, that's influence, that you're setting something up and it has some relation to the future, some future event that you don't know about, right? You're designing something for the future. And then you get more into it and you realize, especially if you get into history, and we did a little bit of the history, is that there's no silver bullet. I mean, Go keeps evolving, and even to this day, it keeps evolving. But like, for example, a good example is this, is the opening strategy has changed. This is Shusaku's opening, and then somewhere in the 70s and 80s, you had the Sanrensei, and people tried that a lot. You had the Kobayashi, who was named after a player. You had the Chinese, excuse me, and then you had the mini Chinese. And these are they're like fads. They're like technologies of the day, right? It's like things they come and go, they change with time. People just get bored, and they want to try new things, right? This is the faddish stuff, right? It's not like any of them are bad. They're all reasonable. You can play a good game with any of those things. It doesn't matter that much, right? And so thinking about like technology, people like to think that certain things matter, but probably not. In the essence, the fundamentals are the most important things, right? The fundamentals. And you can find this with many technologies. I find myself personally, like I use Clojure and ClojureScript. And like, of course, when I started out, like Lisp and like, macros and metaprogramming and all kinds of crazy stuff you can do. But honestly, in my day job, it's like I write a couple functions. I design some data. That's it. I mean, a lot of the hard problems that we work on don't move past that. The very basic things that I learned when I started learning about functional programming, right? That's the stuff that I'm using, the fundamentals. Simplicity. It seems like, simplicity is too simple. You couldn't do that much with it. This is the Yugen no Ma room in the Nihonkin in Tokyo. This is where the title matches are sometimes played. And in the background, that's a piece of calligraphy by Yasunori Kawabata, the man who wrote Meijin, that last retirement match. And it's effectively something to the effect of endless depths. Okay, so for those of you who are curious about the game, in the days of YouTube, you can find things online. I can't swear by anything in the video, so these are the books that I learn with. I still think they're good. There's a Japanese book called Graded Go Problems for Beginners. It's really great. It's really easy. I think you can pick up the basics really fast with just this book. Janice Kim wrote a book called Learn to Play Go, which I also think is like a good sort of starting place if you're curious about the game. You can play online. It's not the community is definitely not as active as it is in Asia, but there are active enough communities in the West. Online Go is probably the most popular for beginners, and that's definitely a good place to start. Online Go server is kind of modeled after light chess. There's also KGS, which is sort of old school, but actually it's one of my favorite. It's not because of like being able to get games, but because I think it's weird. The UI is actually sensible, even though it's like in this crazy Java client from the year 2000, literally 2001. That's when that client was written, but I like it. And then there's PandaNet, which I think actually is written in ClojureScript, which is pretty cool. There's just so much more stuff. When I was starting out, it was like impossible. It was impossible to learn anything about this game. But now it's like you've got these online Go servers, these communities, you've got forums, you've got places where you can upload your files. If you get into the game and you start getting pretty good, you're like, oh, I would like to get better. You can just post your file online and people will leave comments, like code review, right? But it's like your Go game review. And then, of course, with AlphaGo, open source reinforcement learning-based Go playing engines exist. And they've been integrated into almost every server. So this is not very useful if you're a beginner, but if you decide to stick with it and you're pretty good, it's amazing, right? Because you can look at a game and it's very easy to identify things that you missed or things that you misjudged. You can join a club. If you're from a major city, it's actually really easy. The American Go Association has clubs in every major city. I mean, definitely if you're in close to a major metropolitan area, there is a Go club. And it's probably a part of the AGA. So yeah, that's it. I hope you enjoyed that, and go have fun.